Okay, we are recording, and a very warm welcome to all of you. And it's brilliant. I'm very pleased to see some of our friends from Guildford Choral here tonight. You are welcome, as indeed are lots of our familiar Epworth Choir faces here. So as I think you'll have seen in some of the blurb that Lawrence and I have sent round between our Wednesday evening rehearsals, the idea with these is that we can all benefit, Lawrence and I included, by learning a little bit more about this piece, and it will also feed back into our rehearsals and when we actually sing the notes and get to a little bit more insight into this amazing piece. So we have, I think, 5 in total sessions, which are going to be fortnightly. This is the very first one, and this is intended to be a real overview of the piece itself. So we're roughly going to be working to the following section. So I'm going to start off talking a little bit about the piece itself, the context as far as Handel's concerned and why it was written. And then I'm going to hand over to Lawrence, who's going to talk about the piece itself, not just the form and the structure, but a little bit around the theology of it, perhaps. Again, easily something that we don't really take into consideration when we perform it nowadays. I'm going to then wrap up by talking a little bit more about the first performance and the premiere, and then the subsequent premieres outside of Ireland, and the performance history since then in the centuries that have followed. And then Lawrence and I will share a few thoughts from our own experience of performing it many times, and then look forward to hearing from you guys about your experiences with it and any questions or answers you may have. Lawrence, great to have you here this evening. You're very welcome, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you've discovered and what you can share with us this evening. When we were preparing for this over the weekend and Lawrence and I were in touch, we actually said we've really enjoyed this opportunity to learn, research this amazing piece of music a little bit more. It's so easy with these sorts of, with a piece as famous as this, just to keep sort of pulling it off the shelf. Oh, I know this one, I know how this goes, I know what it's about, I know all there is to know. And actually there's so much, you could spend a lifetime just on one piece or on this small area of Handel's output to occupy oneself, because there really is so much one can learn. So it's been a great opportunity, I think, for both of us to get a bit deeper into this piece. So I'm going to start off talking a little bit about the context and the background to this. What I didn't want to do was basically give a biography of Handel's life. There's an awful lot you can read about Handel, you know, on the internet, Wikipedia and Google and all those things. If you don't know much about Handel, do read more. There's a fantastic book by Jane Glover called Handel's London, or London with Handel, or something like that. And it's really, really well written, and I would heartily recommend that to anybody who's interested in knowing a little bit more. I can circulate the name of that on the chat at the end a little bit. So Handel, very easy dates to remember because he has the same as Bach. Born in 1685, lived a little bit longer, but born in 1685. Handel died in 1759, Bach in 1750. So they really were contemporaries and both giants of composition. Born in a place called Halle, H-A-L-L-E, in Germany. But of course, Handel, although born in Germany, took up permanent residence in London in 1712. So fairly young, and became a full naturalized British subject in 1727, also slightly respelling his name and anglicizing it to Frederick, his middle name, rather than Friedrich as it was spelt in the German. By 1741, his profile in British music was cemented by the numerous honours and accolades that he had bestowed upon him. He had a pension from the court of George II, and he held the post of composer of music for the Chapel Royal. Above those living jobs and roles that he had, perhaps one of the most unusual things for a living person to have at that time was a statue erected in his honour in Vauxhall Gardens. And apparently this was extremely unusual. A statue or something of that prominence was nearly always saved until after somebody had died. But Handel enjoyed seeing this in his own lifetime. So it gives us some indication just quite how highly he was regarded by society at this time. He composed prolifically and across a huge range of genres. I'm sure we're all aware of everything from keyboard music to sacred to secular songs to instrumental music. One of his great outputs, one of the things he really forged ahead as a genre and a form, was Italian opera. He'd introduced this to London in 1711 with his opera Rinaldo. And he subsequently wrote and produced and presented more than 40 Italian operas in London theatres across the rest of his lifetime. So he was a real pioneer of this as a genre, and really became the founding stone of Italian opera as we now know it. By the early 1730s, so over 20 years after Rinaldo first premiered, public taste for Italian opera in London was starting to fade slightly. The popular success of The Beggar's Opera was written by John Gay and Johann Pepusch, was first performed in 1728. And that really sort of rocked the system and heralded a big space of English language, what were known as ballad operas. And they basically mocked Italian opera very openly, and they were hugely popular. With the consequential box office failings that came from Handel's Italian operas, productions were being reined back. They were becoming fewer in number and increasingly reliant on the nobility and the aristocracy and royalty to fund their very existence. But this funding itself became even harder to obtain after the launch in 1730 of what was called Opera of the Nobility, which was a rival company to Handel's own. Handel persevered with his own productions and his own compositions and premieres, but ended up self-funding and a huge amount of it, which for a very established and very respected composer was a very unusual thing for him to be having to self-fund a lot of his projects. So although prospects for Italian opera were declining, Handel did remain committed to the genre, but he needed to produce alternative stage works, and he knew that there was demand for the English language in performance. So he began to develop the genre of English language oratorios. On a visit to Rome in 1707 to 1708, he'd written 2 Italian oratorios at a time where opera in the city of Rome had been temporarily forbidden by a papal decree. His first venture into English oratorio had been a piece called Esther, which many of you may have heard of, which was written and performed for a private patron in around 1718. In 1732, Handel brought and revised an expanded version of Esther to the King's Theatre in Haymarket in London, where members of the royal family attended a very star-studded and celebrated premiere on the 6th of May, 1732. Its success encouraged Handel to write 2 more oratorios, Deborah and Natalia. All 3 of these oratorios, as there now were performed to large and very appreciative audiences at the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford in mid-1733. As a little anecdote, apparently undergraduates sold their furniture to raise money for the 5-shilling tickets. Whether undergraduates nowadays would be prepared to do that, who knows? In 1735, Handel received the text for a new oratorio called Saul from a librettist called Charles Jennens. He was a wealthy landowner with a high skill and high training in music and literature and the arts. Handel's main creative concern was still with opera, so he didn't write the music for Saul until 1738, 3 years later, in preparation for his 1738-39 season. The work opened at the King's Theatre in January 1739 to a warm and appreciative audience, and was quickly followed by the less successfully received oratorio, Israel in Egypt. The libretto for Israel in Egypt is not 100% confirmed, but it's suspected that that may also have been by Jennens. Although Handel continued to write operas, the trend towards these English language productions became more and more irresistible, more and more popular as the decade moved on. After 3 performances of his final Italian opera, Didamia, in January and February of 1741, he abandoned the genre completely. In July of 1741, Jennens sent him a new libretto for an oratorio. In a letter dated 10th of July to his friend Edward Holdsworth, Jennens wrote, "I hope Handel will lay out his whole genius and skill upon it, that the composition may excel all his former compositions, as the subject excels every other subject. This subject is Messiah." So onto the compositional process of Messiah. Now we've seen how the context worked from the shift from Italian opera into this new genre, which was slightly forced upon him, but one that he embraced. So the music for Messiah was composed after just 24 days of incredibly swift composing. Having received Jennens' libretto sometime after the 10th of July 1741, Handel began work on it in mid-August. His records show that he completed part 1 in outline by the 28th of August, part 2 by the 6th of September, and part 3 by the 12th of September, followed by what he called 2 days of filing up to produce the finished work on the 14th of September. So an incredible pace to be working. Interestingly, this very quick pace was not seen by Jennens, the librettist, as a sign of energy, but rather as, quote, careless negligence. And the relations as a result between the two men became and remained slightly strained. Jennens wrote and urged Handel to make many improvements, while the composer stubbornly refused. The score's 259 pages shows lots of signs of haste, blots on the page, scratching out, unfilled bars, loads of uncorrected errors, but according to lots of scholars, the number of errors for the speed at which Handel was writing was incredibly small. So albeit, you know, bumps and scrapes along the way, given how much music he wrote in such a short space of time, it was surprisingly blemish-free. The original manuscript for Messiah is now held in the British Library, and it's scored for 2 trumpets, timpani, 2 oboes, 2 violin parts, strings, and continuo. So actually a pretty small orchestra as Baroque music of this time went. At the end of his manuscript, Handel wrote the letters SDG, Soli Deo Gloria, or to God alone the glory. This inscription, taken with the speed of the composition and how quickly he wrote it, has encouraged belief in a slightly apocryphal story that Handel wrote the music with the fervor of sort of divine inspiration. Lots of people believe that the Alleluia chorus was written as a sort of almost evangelical reception of the notes and the words. However, critics have pointed out that lots of Handel's operas were a similar length and complexity to Messiah, and also written very, very quickly. Messiah was exceptional, but it was not uncommon for Handel to write these colossal works of huge scale and complexity in very quick time. Obviously, very often, as we all know nowadays, people writing to commissions, writing to demands that people need to fulfill deadlines. Handel commenced his next oratorio, Samson, within only a week of finishing Messiah, and the whole draft was finished within a month. In accordance with his frequent practice when writing new works, Handel adapted lots of music and material he'd written before. So he reused material from Messiah in Samson, and in Messiah itself, he drew upon lots of repertoire that he'd written for the Italian opera and the Italian oratorio genre before. So next time you hear the piece, know that "O death, where is thy sting?" "His yoke is easy," and the chorus "and he shall purify" were all taken very literally from earlier works that Handel had written. "Unto us a child is born," and "All we like sheep" are also reworkings, not quite as literally as the previous ones, but also reworkings of existing Handel material. His instrumentation, interestingly, is often very imprecise. Again, along with contemporary convention, it often depended what musicians, what performances, what budget was available. So even in his scoring, in his original manuscript, there are sections missing where it is known that he would have wanted the trumpets or the oboes to double certain vocal lines. And he just didn't write them in or made suggestions that they were ad lib, that performers would choose to double lines here and there if they were available, or be left out if those instruments weren't available. I'm going to loop back to this idea once we've now heard from Lawrence, but this idea that things are actually very fluid in the compositional and performance process, that this idea of everything being laid down in black and white, never to be changed again, is actually something that we've projected on to this piece. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more when we hear about the premiere and about the subsequent performances over the many years since. But hopefully that's given us a little bit of context. And now I'm going to hand over to Lawrence, who's going to talk about the piece itself. Thanks, Lawrence.
Well, thanks very much, Michael. We've done well. There's only half a quote I've had to scrub from mine, so glad we found on the same page there. Great. Well, look, everyone, I thought this has been really fascinating to research the idea of the form of the Messiah, because I think what's quite interesting for a lot of us as singers, we do a lot of oratorios, we do a lot of requiems, and to name a few, Elijah, Dream of Gerontius, all these oratorios that we do. And I thought I'd just start by having a quick look back at actually how on earth did this genre come about. Michael alluded to it briefly. And actually oratorio, as he said, started life in Italy, particularly in Rome, and it was an alternative to opera. So when the churches decided, particularly in Lent you weren't really allowed to be having your opera or having any fun. So instead, cardinals would commission these works that could be performed in a church. And actually for a long time they were interchangeable with opera. Some of them were semi-staged in the same way opera was. And all of them at that time would address particular themes of morality. But they were a really good excuse for composers to use all the techniques they'd developed in the theatre to create particular effects. And plenty of those come up in the Messiah. And the first one of these, which is the Rappresentazione di Anima e di Corpo by what's his name? Cavalieri, which, funny enough, is a piece I've actually done and is sort of fun if you're into that kind of music, but it's very, very loose. It doesn't look like the Messiah. In some ways, there are things that do look similar. So you get choruses where everyone comes on stage and says something, and you go, oh yeah, that's a bit like Messiah, where they do that after the soloist has done his thing. But we don't have this distinction between the recit bit, where they crack on with just saying something that needs to be said. Oh, I'm off to get a coffee now, and then the aria, which is more about how they feel about the coffee. There's far more, and then the chorus goes, isn't it great we all have coffee? We don't really have that form so much at this stage of things. And but they tended to be based on concepts and themes, very, very much linked with the idea of Greek concepts and talking about morality and so forth. Carissimi, who was perhaps one of the most prolific composers of oratorio, wrote 16 oratorios based on the Old Testament. That he was around a similar time to Handel, just before. And obviously when Handel nipped into Rome as part of his training, he came from Germany down to Rome and then went up to England. And the 2 years he spent in Rome were hugely influential on everything he did. As Michael said, he wrote his first oratorio, Il Trionfo del Tempo e del Disinganno, which is all about a sort of discussion about time, and that's where they're very obsessed with this idea of time passing back then, which is, I think, probably something we could all relate to in COVID, isn't it? So that was his first oratorio, but it wouldn't have sounded particularly like the ones we knew. And what's quite interesting is the themes around this time. This is relevant to the Messiah. The themes tended to be about quite specific situations. So if they weren't about a moral theme, they might be some, for example, Charpentier, his oratorio, The Denial of St. Peter, or Carissimi's Dives Malus, which is about the rich man and Lazarus. And it was very rare you got sort of an overarching theme like Messiah. which is more of a sort of concept. And so that's something we'll nip back to. Certainly, one of the things that wasn't acceptable back then was you were definitely not allowed to make Jesus into a character. If Jesus was seen as a character on stage, the only thing he certainly wasn't allowed in an opera, and the only thing he was allowed to do on stage was say the exact words that Jesus said in the Gospel. And certainly nothing else was allowed to be made up about what he might think or say. I think we probably got to the 20th century, didn't we, before we had operas with Jesus on stage. So, of course, the model we have, the only model at that stage, is the Passions. So many of you will know the Matthew Passion, the John Passion, and Handel himself wrote the Brocker's Passion. Funnily enough, a work he wrote in London and sent back to Halle for performance. But there we go. And in those situations, Jesus is allowed to be represented, but only ever saying the exact text that Jesus says from the Gospel. So that's sort of our background. And as Michael very kindly said, I'll now talk about sort of how the English oratorio came into being. They had opera was in its Italian form was established in England, and really very little changed to make it marketed for the English audience. I think for a long time the English thought it was just absolutely fantastic that all these amazing Italian musicians were coming. And reading Jane Glover's book on Handel, which Michael recently started reading, I think, as well, and I thoroughly commend to you, you actually find out half of it was really about gossip and making sure that there were two singers on stage always having a good quarrel with each other behind the scenes, and the newspapers could write about it all the next day. So actually, the idea of performing Italian opera, or opera at least, was working on a number of different levels. And as Michael said, there were experiments with this idea of oratorio. 1718, he wrote Esther, and that was in 6 scenes, so we weren't really in 3 acts. When Handel revived Esther in 1732 for putting on in the theatre, by the way, Esther had before that been put on in a room above a tavern in a pub, so it was obviously a very loose. They hadn't quite decided where he should be performing oratorio at this stage. It was condensed into 3 acts. And that's quite significant because audiences around that time were used to that. You would go to the opera, you would do your first act, have an interval, do the second act, have an interval, and then the third act, and that was your 3 hours of entertainment, and that was sort of the expected form. So this is the first thing I'd say, which is quite interesting. We kind of just accept the Messiah. Oh yeah, it's 3 parts of the Messiah, and sometimes we miss a bit out here and there, but it's always in 3 acts, and we never quite know whether we put the interval after the first act or the second act, and generally it goes after the first. But it actually comes from opera, which is quite important. What I think was quite interesting about the Messiah, for me, it's this perfect distillation of choruses and solos. So unlike those earlier oratorios / opera, by now we have very clearly defined recitative moments, arias for soloists, and chorus moments as well. And by this stage, of course, we had Saul and Israel in Egypt, which Michael both mentioned. I think what's quite interesting about both of those, Saul is far more like opera you would go and see an Italian opera, but it happens to be in English, and it happens to be about an Old Testament subject. Again, I mentioned earlier this idea that oratorios had to be Old Testament subjects, quite the contrast to Messiah, which immediately sets us in the New Testament. And in Saul, Jennens wrote an original libretto. There are parts of it extracted from the Bible. The first chorus, "How excellent is thy name," is Psalm 8, I think. But the rest of it is very much written in an operatic way that you're meant to feel certain emotions with the characters and their anger and be involved. And there's a lot of material that isn't in the Bible that is written to enhance that story. Israel in Egypt was the complete opposite of that. It was just extracting bits from the Bible, and it was a very chorus-based work. And that meant actually that Handel, from a musical point of view, was far more influenced by the English stream of music. So we think composers like Purcell, Maurice Greene, Boyce might have been on the scene by that stage. And those composers who were writing far more church music and anthems. Of course, Handel's big invention to that was writing the coronation anthems, Zadok the priest, My Heart is Inditing. He'd already been involved with the Chandos anthems, psalm settings. And Israel and Egypt, musically, is taking all those theatrical themes and theatrical orchestrations into a very dramatic story, but actually just focusing really on setting scripture. But it's a very choral work. There's very little solo work in Israel and Egypt. Saul, on the other hand, was opera with an original script and so on. And actually, when we get to Messiah, what's a really fascinating thing is he sort of took both those works and took the best of both with Jennings. And so Jennings doesn't write any original material. He takes extracts from various parts of the Bible, and that material is purely biblical material. There's no sort of commentary on what's going on like there was in Saul. And at the same time, Handel decides that perhaps there were too many choruses in Israel and Egypt, and we need a better balance somewhere between the operatic of Saul and the choral dominance of Israel and Egypt. And so you have this, I think one of the reasons it's such a successful piece is we have these constant sequences of solos, maybe some recitative, delivering into a chorus at the end of that. And so there's almost this very pleasing format you get as a singer, where you get to go, yes, I think what the soloist has just sung was right. And I'm now going to sing about why that was right. So there's some nice continuity there. One of the interesting things I think is we think it's very likely that Jennings gave Handel a scheme that had arias and choruses, perhaps suggested already in the libretto, hoping that that's exactly what Handel would do, and perhaps that's where some of that relationship broke down later on when Jennings felt perhaps what Handel delivered wasn't completely correct. Michael gave that quote, and the bit just before it's interesting from point of view. He says, Handel says he will do nothing next winter, but I hope I shall persuade him to set another scripture collection I have made for him and perform it for his own benefit in Passion Week, which is why we think Israel and Egypt, he says scripture collection, we think Israel and Egypt was Jennings as well, would make sense. And the idea that this had to be performed in Passion Week was important for the audiences at the time, would have seen that actually the idea of an oratorio being performed in Lent was acceptable and corresponded to the passions that we were talking about earlier. So I'm just going to share the screen very briefly, because we tend to think of everything in part 1, 2 and 3, but actually Jennings thought about this in a slightly different way. There we go, so you can all see that now. Our trusty friend Wikipedia saved me having to write all this out today, thank God. And this is the scheme by which Jennings actually wrote into the original word book that was at the first performance. So it's not just part 1, part 2, part 3. There's clearly something going on here. And whilst you have a look at that, I will just read you what Jennings actually wrote. He said in part 1, scene 1 is Isaiah's prophecy of salvation, the gospel or good news. Part 2, the judgment that will accompany the appearance of a saviour. Scene 3, the specific prophecy of the Christ birth. Scene 4, the incarnation announced to the shepherds near Bethlehem. Part 5, the redemption and healing brought by the Saviour. So the idea of birth, and actually I think what's something which always fascinates me in Messiah is how quickly we get through the miracles, and actually that main part of the gospel is not hugely included in what Jennings is trying to put across here, all the miracles, all the preaching. Actually, this is far more about his birth and the prophecy in that first part. And we finish the first part with his yoke is easy, his burden is light. It's not, it's great he did all these miracles that we tend to associate. It's far more centered around the idea of the prophecy as a whole. And then part 2, scene 1, Christ's passion, scourging and crucifixion. Scene 2, Christ's death and resurrection. Scene 3, Christ's ascension. Scene 4, Christ's reception in heaven. Scene 5, Whitsun and the subsequent preaching of the gospel. Scene 6, the world's hostile receptions of the gospel. And scene 7, God's ultimate victory. So again, there we are crashing quite quickly through the crucifixion scene. Actually, by scene 3, he's ascended to heaven. So we tend to think of part 2, I think, again, as just crucifixion and resurrection, but actually it's more heavily focused, I think, on getting the preaching of the gospel going. And in part 3, I won't read you all because they're actually quite similar to the Wikipedia page, and I'll stop showing the screen now. But interesting to see that Jennings had this idea of it running through, and that part 3 is far more focused on salvation than anything else. Donald Burrows, in his quite good book about the Messiah, Cambridge Music book about that, says this: Jennings pays almost no attention to what Jesus said or did, because Messiah is not about these things. The subject of the drama is God's redemption of mankind through the Messiah, and the conflicts involved are viewed from cosmic and eternal perspectives. And I think that's a really, really fascinating thing. I think it's partly why it's such an enduring piece, because it is this idea of redemption through mankind, redemption of mankind through the Messiah, not about the drama so much, and this idea of cosmic, eternal perspectives. And so in following this 3-act scheme, we see that actually the soloists and the choir are as narrators in the Messiah. We never actually particularly say anything. We never say anything Jesus says. A whole piece about the Messiah without anything Jesus says. You might immediately go, well, no, hold on, comfort ye, my people. Yes, there are elements of that might sound like the Sermon on the Mount, but actually, it's from Isaiah, and a lot of the Old Testament readings come up in it. So it's not a human drama like Saul is. But I think it has this sort of lasting effect, and some of that's to do with the theology, which I'll finish up in this last 3 minutes about the theology. Jennings was a Church of England man, very high church. We would consider him that. So he was obsessed with this sort of mysticism of Christ. And in bringing the text together, he joined together a selection of Old Testament and New Testament texts, generally from the King James Bible or the Coverdale Psalms, which is in the Book of Common Prayer, and actually Trauskin in his Oxford History of Western Music suggests that it's a New Testament subject. The text is largely drawn from the Gospels, which is actually not strictly true. I think a lot of the subject matter is of the Gospels, but far more of the text is from the Psalms and Isaiah. And I think one of the reasons for this is Jennings' influence on the Book of Common Prayer. Apparently, his family home, he would read the Book of Common Prayer and regularly have evensong at his chapel, Gosbau, I think he was. And he would regularly do this with his family. And of course, the Book of Common Prayer, one of the things it really brought in is linking Old Testament to New Testament. So as anyone who's been to evensong or even just a Eucharist will know, we often start with a reading from the Old Testament, and that's meant to illuminate something in the New Testament. And that's called typology, this type of reflective theology. And in doing this, he sort of asserts his views about resurrection and redemption from sin. And that really is the mainstream running through the whole piece. And this is a period when free thinking and deists would have been in conflict with this. Deism being the belief that God created the world and then let it evolve itself. And actually, that's not quite what he's saying here. He's saying actually there was a far larger plan in God's creation, and he's really trying to put that across. And I think he says in his printed word book, Jennings put this at the time, without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifested in the flesh, justified by the Spirit, seen of angels, preached among the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up in glory, in whom are hid all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And I think that's a really interesting summary about what exactly Jennings was trying to achieve with the Messiah, this idea of the plan being there. I'll finish off by just saying that I think one of the reasons it works so well as a piece is there's this versatility to where the Messiah is performed. In fact, it was the only oratorio performed in a church during Handel's lifetime. So this idea that it has this versatility. Sometimes we just do one chorus, sometimes we do this. I think that's got a real appeal to it. I think the culmination of the years of writing and distilling things down, so that's the coronation anthems, the Italian opera, and the experimenting with oratorio, and the fact that he wrote this right at the height of his fame, I think is one reason this piece is so successful. I read someone talking about the choruses as sort of this perfect form. And I think that's right. It always feels like we've gone from A to B with the chorus just in the right time. And then lastly, I think there's this universal story in the Messiah, and this idea of being comforted and through to the resurrection and the afterlife is something I think is universal to all religions and to people of faith and of no faith. I'll finish by just saying this. The perceived characteristics of Handel's oratorios, I think, were neatly summed up by Newborough Hamilton in his preface to the printed libretto for Messiah's twin oratorio, Samson, which of course he wrote straight after. He says this: Mr. Handel happily introduced here oratorios, a music drama whose subject must be scriptural, and in which the solemnity of church music is agreeably united with the most pleasing airs of the stage. And I certainly think that's the experience we all get when we sing the Messiah, is this real comforting that we are complementing everything that the soloists say. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Lawrence. So moving on now from the actual contents of the piece and the nature of the way it's constructed, here's just a little bit of info about the premiere and some thoughts of the performance history over the couple of centuries since. So Handel was giving a season of concerts in Dublin in 1741 to 42, and this arose from an invitation from the Duke of Devonshire, who was also at the time holding the post as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. It was a violinist friend of Handel, who was also the Lord Lieutenant's bandmaster, and he would provide the connection and would eventually look after the tour's orchestral requirements. Whether Handel originally intended to perform Messiah in Dublin is uncertain, and if it was, he certainly didn't inform Jennens of this plan. Jennens wrote to a friend of his in December 1741 saying, "It was some mortification to me to hear that instead of performing Messiah here, he has gone into Ireland with it." After arriving in Dublin in November 1741, Handel arranged a subscription series of 6 concerts to be held between December and February of 1742 at the Great Music Hall, Fishamble Street. These concerts were so popular that a second series was quickly arranged. However, Messiah figured in neither series at this point. In March, Handel began discussions with an appropriate committees for a charity concert to be given in April. He intended to present Messiah at this. He sought and was given permission from both St. Patrick's and Christchurch cathedrals to use their choristers for this occasion. These forces amounted to 16 men and 16 boy choristers, several of whom were then allocated to the solo parts. The women soloists were a lady called Cristina Avoglio, who had sung the main soprano roles in the 2 subscription series concerts prior, and Susanna Kibber, an established stage actress and contralto who had sung in one of these series also. To accommodate Kibber's vocal range, the recitative, "Then shall the eyes of the blind," and the aria, "He shall feed his flock," were transposed down from Handel's original score into F major. The performance, also in the Fishamble Street Hall, was originally announced for the 12th of April, but deferred by 1 day at the request of persons of distinction. The orchestra in Dublin comprised strings, 2 trumpets and timpani. Interestingly, no oboes, despite them being in Handel's original manuscript. The total number of players, however, is unknown, but critically missing the oboes. Handel had his own organ shipped to Ireland for the performances, and it is likely that a harpsichord was also used as part of the continuo body. There were 3 charities that were to benefit from these, and they were Prisoners' Debt Relief, the Mercers Hospital, and the Charitable Infirmary. In its report on a public rehearsal, the Dublin Newsletter, a local paper, described the oratorio as far surpassing anything of that nature which has been performed in this or any other kingdom. A whopping 700 people attended the premiere on the 13th of April. So that the largest possible audience could be admitted, gentlemen were requested to remove their swords and ladies were asked not to wear hooped dresses. The performance earned unanimous praise, and the press included such sayings as words and wanting to express the exquisite delight it afforded to the admiring crowded audience. A Dublin clergyman called Reverend Delaney was so overcome by singing of the aria He Was Despired that he reportedly leapt to his feet during the performance and shouted, "Woman, for this be all thy sins forgiven thee." The takings from that amounted to £400, which provided £127 to each of the 3 charities and, fascinatingly, secured alone the release of 142 indebted prisoners. Just from this one premiere, 142 indebted prisoners were released off the back of this. Handel remained in Dublin for 4 months after this premiere. He organised a second performance of Messiah on the 3rd of June, and it was announced as the last performance of Mr. Handel's stay in this kingdom. In this second performance, which was for Handel's private financial benefit, not for charity on this instance, Kibbe reprised her role from the first performance, though the other female soloist, Avolio, was likely replaced by somebody else. Details of the instrumentation, the numbers, whether other instruments and what have you were missing from that performance are not known. And so to London. Following the warm reception to Messiah in Dublin, it was not the same story in London. Indeed, even the announcement of the performance as, quote, a new sacred oratorio drew one commentator to say, is the playhouse a fit temple for this performance? Handel introduced the work to London at the Covent Garden Theatre in March 1743. Avolio and Kibbe, again, were the 2 chief female soloists. They were joined by a tenor and a bass who were both veterans of Handel's arias. Interestingly, there were 2 other soprano solos in this, although it's not known how the 4 female singers exactly shared the roles of the soprano and alto arias. The first performance was overshadowed by views expressed in the press that the work's subject matter was too exalted to be performed in a theatre, particularly by singers who were known to be secular singer-actresses. In an attempt to deflect these views, Handel avoided the name Messiah altogether and presented it as simply my new sacred oratorio. As was his custom, Handel rearranged the music again to suit the singers. He wrote a new setting of "And Lo, the Angel of the Lord" for one of the singers, and this was never used again subsequently. He added a tenor number for the tenor singer, Their Sound Is Gone Out, which did appear in Jennings' original libretto, but had not been used in the Dublin performances and the piece's initial premiere. As a little anecdote, the custom of standing for the Alleluia chorus, which now forms such an integral part of our modern performances, originates from a popular belief that it was at this London premiere that King George II rose to his feet, and thus it was obliged that all other people in his presence would be forced to stand also. There is sadly no convincing evidence that this happened, or indeed that the king himself was present. However, it lives on in folklore today. And there is in written evidence and anecdotal evidence of this happening before Handel's death, that the convention had arisen that people would stand for this one chorus. London's initially cool reception of Messiah led Handel to reduce the planned 6 performances to just 3. and in 1744 not to present the work at all. This was to considerable annoyance of Jennens, whose relations with the composer had become soured around its composition and were only worsened by this. At Jennens' request, Handel made several changes to the music for a revival the following year in 1745. Their Sound is Gone Out became a chorus, and the soprano number, Rejoice Greatly, was recomposed into a much shorter form and transposed to a different key. Jennens wrote in 1745, Handel has made a fine entertainment of it, though not so good as he might have done, or indeed ought to have done. I have with great difficulty made him correct some of the gross faults in this composition. Handel directed 2 performances in Covent Garden in 1745 and then set the work aside completely for 4 years. In 1749, beg your pardon, there was a revival at Covent Garden, again under this time now the proper title of Messiah. It saw the appearance of 2 female soloists this time, not the 2 who had been involved with the initial London premiere and the Dublin premiere, but 2 relatively unknown sopranos. In the following year, these were joined by a male alto, so no longer a female alto, but a male alto, a countertenor, for which Handel composed new versions of But Who May Abide and Thou Art Gone Up on High. The year 1750 also saw the institution of the annual charity performances of Messiahs at London's Foundling Hospital, which continued until Handel's death and beyond. The 1754 performance at the Foundling Hospital is the first for which full details of the orchestral and vocal forces survive. This orchestra, at this point, included 15 violins, 5 violas, 3 cellos, 2 double basses, 4 bassoons, 4 oboes, 2 trumpets, 2 French horns, and timpani. The chorus of 19 were 6 trebles from the Chapel Royal. The remainder were all men, male altos, and obviously the tenors and basses. There were 5 soloists, all of whom were required to double the chorus. There were transposed arias, rewritten sections, all to suit the particular soloist's strengths and or weaknesses. By 1754, Handel was severely afflicted by the onset of blindness, and in 1755, he handed over the direction of the Foundling Hospital performances of the Messiahs to a pupil of his. It's understood that he resumed his duty and conducted a final performance on or around 1757. The final performance at which Handel was present was at Covent Garden in 1759. This was just 8 days before Handel died. And so onto a potted history of the subsequent performance history post Handel's death, and I'll do a quick potted look at the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries. During the 1750s, in and around the time of Handel's death and beyond, Messiah was becoming increasingly performed at festivals and cathedrals throughout the UK. Choruses and arias, as Lawrence has already mentioned, were immediately used in isolation and extracted from the Messiah as a whole to become anthems and motets in church services. They also were extracted to form concert pieces, and this was a practice that grew throughout the 19th century through to the present day. Performances of Messiah became global, and as early as the 1760s and 1770s, there were performances in Florence, Hamburg, and even in New York. It was a performance in Mannheim in 1777 where the young Mozart first heard it. For the performances in Handel's lifetime and the performances in the few decades immediately following his death, the musical forces and the numbers I discussed that we used at the Foundling Hospital performances at 1754 are thought to be pretty typical. By the 1780s, however, a fashion for larger scale and souped-up performances was beginning to appear. There were a series of commemorative concerts of Handel's music given in Westminster Abbey under the patronage of George III. There's a plaque on the wall of Westminster Abbey that records that the band consisted of 525 vocal and instrumental performers, and it was conducted by Uriah Bates. In 1955, an article by Sir Malcolm Sargent, who was a big proponent of these large-scale Handel performances, wrote, Mr. Bates, had known Handel well and respected his wishes. The orchestra employed was 250 strong, 12 horns, 12 trumpets, 6 trombones, 3 pairs of timpani, some which were made especially large. In the late 1780s, further performances were given at Westminster Abbey, and adverts made a special point of saying the band for this performance will consist of 800 performers. In continental Europe, performances of the Messiah were departing from Handel's practice in lots of different ways. The scores were being drastically reorchestrated to suit contemporary taste. In 1786, Messiah was radically overhauled for a performance in Berlin Cathedral. In 1788, a performance was given with huge revisions for a choir that consisted of 259 singers, 87 string players, multiple wind and brass players, numbers that just seem completely foreign to us now. One interesting diversion of all the numerous rewritings and rescorings was one in 1789 that was made by Mozart. He was commissioned to reorchestrate several works by Handel, including the Messiah. He was writing for a relatively small scale performance at this point. He got rid of the organ continuo part completely, and he added parts for flutes, clarinets, trombones, and horns. He recomposed lots of passages and rearranged others. This was a performance for the Esterházys in 1789. It had 4 soloists and just 12 singers. Mozart's arrangement was fully published in 1809, and a contemporary scholar wrote, which I thought was a nice quote, Mozart's arrangement is stucco ornaments on a marble temple. Mozart was apparently slightly circumspect about his changes, and he insisted that these alterations to Handel's score should be seen as efforts just to adapt and not to improve Handel's music. Elements of Mozart's revisions became known to British audiences, and an arranger and musical scholar called Ebenezer Prout, who I'll mention a little bit later, actively incorporated some of Mozart's changes. 19th century, and approaches to Handel in German and English-speaking countries diverged even further. In Leipzig, in the middle of the 19th century, was founded the Deutsche Handelgesellschaft, which was basically set to establish to provide authentic editions and original editions of Handel's works and how he'd first conceived them. Performances in Britain and the US were still moving away from Handel's performance practice with increasingly grandiose renditions. Performances in New York in 1850s had choruses of 300. Performances in Boston in the 1860s had performances with more than 600. In Britain was established a great Handel festival, and one of the culminating performances of that was a performance of Messiah in the Crystal Palace in 1857. There were 2,000 singers and an orchestra of 500. In the 1860s and 1870s, things grew and grew even further. Bernard Shaw, the great name, he had a role as a music critic and commented, "The stale wonderment which the great chorus never fails to elicit has become exhausted." He later wrote, "Why, instead of wasting huge sums on the multitudinous dullness of a Handel's festival, does not somebody set up a thoroughly rehearsed and exhaustively studied performance of the Messiah in St. James's Hall with a chorus of 20 capable artists, perhaps? Most of us will be glad to hear the work seriously performed once before we die." So the employment of huge forces necessitated considerable augmentation of the orchestral parts. As we've heard, the addition of trombones, French horns, none of which originated in Handel's manuscript, required rewriting. But people believed that it was a fluid process and that if Handel had these instruments and these huge forces available to him in his day, he would have written for them. One of the driving forces for these huge scale performances, and one which is relevant to us, was the ubiquity of choral societies across the United Kingdom. It's become such a mainstay, and these choral societies, many of which were established in the 19th century and flourished in the early 20th century, required huge performances when these choral societies of 100, 200, 300 performers needed bigger and padded out orchestras. And so finally to the 20th century and beyond. The large-scale oratorio tradition in the cathedrals and from the choral societies was perpetuated well through and into the 20th century. Mozart's rearrangements had become an integral part with the addition of the flutes and the clarinets, as had this fluidity surrounding doubling of brass and the addition of timpani, extra timpani, trombones and horns. Ebenezer Prout, who I mentioned earlier, became a driving force behind a more faithful reproduction of Handel's original score. However, he did comment on some practical issues, largely. With our choral societies of such size, additional complements of some kind are necessary for an effective performance. The question is not so much whether, but as how they are to be written. And so he helped perpetuate this idea of adding instruments to all of this. There were other great names like Chrysander. He was at the forefront of creating more scholarly editions and things that was just seen generally as being more faithful to what Handel may have intended at the outset. Interestingly, despite Handel's heritage, Messiah did not enjoy huge popularity in Germany, nowhere near the extent it enjoyed in the UK in the 20th century. However, when performances were given in Germany, it was much more medium to small size forces that were the norm. A performance of the Three Choirs Festival, after a short hiatus in performances for the decade or so before in 1935, really helped establish the Messiah as a core part of the repertory for English festivals and performances. And so in the later 20th century became the great revival of period instruments, and hand in hand with that and the looking back to the instruments and the recreation of instruments that Handel would have known and employed, developed around it a more scholarly approach to Handel's original ideas. And the nature and the quality of those period instruments also then forced a rethinking of the sheer numbers of performances and performers, and therefore the actual number of people singing along, because obviously the number in the orchestra has a direct relation on the number in the choir and vice versa. But all this leads on, and what I'm going to just talk about with Lawrence firstly now is just this idea that it's an incredibly fluid force. And my final thought is from the great contemporary Handel scholar, Winton Dean. He wrote, "There is still plenty for scholars to fight over, even more than ever for conductors to decide for themselves. Indeed, if they are not prepared to grapple with the problems presented by Handel's score, they ought not to conduct it. This applies not only to the choice of versions, but to every aspect of Baroque practice. And of course, let's not forget, there are no definite answers." So there's a little potted summary about the journey of the performance history. And I'd just like to begin by, we're only going to spend 5 or so minutes just talking about this. And I want to just ask Lawrence what his thoughts are. One of the things I was astonished by researching all of this was just the enormous scale of some of these performances with high hundreds, if not thousands of performers. And my initial thought with this is they must have been slightly rough around the edges. Do you think? To have that number of performers, I mean, not only the space they must have taken up, but just the limitations of that number of people. Do you think they must have been a bit of a sort of unwieldy machine?
Yeah, I suspect so, and I think one only has to go back to hear some recordings, even from the 30s, where 40s, once you can make out where it's a little shoddy around the edges. I mean, don't forget, there's also some different things like the first performance of Elijah. Was it something like 120 altos, and they were mainly men. So you also had those sort of differences going on, which would have really affected the sound. Speeds were different back then as well. We take everything a heck of a pace faster now, and so yeah, the whole experience would have been a very, very different experience to what we come across now.
Definitely. And I guess, as with so much music, not just music of the Baroque, the explosion of the recording industry forced an awful lot of sort of quality control, that people got used to hearing recordings of Messiah at home, where things can be rehearsed, edited, redone to strive for perfection in inverted commas, that people then want to hear that when they go and see a live performance and hear a live performance. So I'm sure the recording industry has had a huge influence on the way Messiah is performed and the necessity to use slightly fewer performers, certainly not the high hundreds of performers that they would have had back then.
Yeah, I think so. And, I think even you don't need to go that far back to find the days where, there was a choral society in Yorkshire doing the Messiah at least once every weekend. That's not that far back. But I certainly think the recording industry has pushed so many different perspectives now that it leaves open the question of how do you do it? Do you do it with a Baroque orchestra? Do you do it with small numbers, large numbers? And I think what's quite interesting about Messiah is it stands out as this work you can sort of get away with doing it how you want. I think nowadays we tend to look at Bach and treat that with this far more reverence and holiness. I think there's something robust about Handel's music, and that's a brilliant quality of a mark of the composer. That it's robust. You can do it with 1,000 people or 10 people, and it still works and still has an emotional impact.
I think that's a very good observation, that we do treat Bach's music with perhaps too much reverence, or perhaps it doesn't scale up as well. And likewise, we as an industry don't choose to scale up Handel. We also don't scale back Mahler and Wagner to single strings and single woodwind and brass, but Handel does have this amazing flexibility and robustness that means, as you say, you can do it with 10 people or 1,000 people and it still works extremely well. You and I have both done Messiah a few times over our years. Tell us a little bit about how you find the bass arias. There's not a huge amount for the bass to do, really, is there? How do you find the arias from a dramatic perspective with what comes either side of them? And how do you find the arias themselves? Because I often think with the bass arias, they are, you've got For Behold, Darkness Shall Cover the Earth, and that very sort of slightly sinister, creeping, very exposed number. And then you've got later on The Trumpet Shall Sound, which is this much more declamatory aria. Do you think they were written for one voice, or do you think they're actually stylistically extremely different?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to focus in on just the bass arias for a moment. I actually think the bass's role in the Messiah is quite an interesting one because it does change, but the bass is always used to herald almost like some sort of Old Testament God speaking to Abraham type figure. And there's a thematic link for me throughout the whole of all those arias. So the first one you get is Thus saith the Lord I am. So if you just think ya-dee-da-dum for a moment, you've got a nice triad going down. And then the next one, For behold, da-dee-da-dee-dum. So we've got ya-da-dee-dum, another triad. And when we get to Why Divinations, Why to the name. So you've got another triad going up now, because we've gone through the crucifixion, and we're now into redemption. Then finally, Behold, I tell you a me, ya-ba-ba-bum. And then the aria which accompanies that, the trumpet, yum ba 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 dum ba dum ba dum ba 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 bee. And finally, we've made the whole redemption by the trumpet sounding, and that sort of musical completion is in the theology of it as well. So yeah, I find it really fascinating singing those arias because they are such cornerstones in the Messiah, both theologically and of course when you come to sing The Trumpet Shall Sound, it's just wonderful because the soprano has sung I Know That My Redeemer, and everyone is in this wonderful state but is eager for yes, now the bass sings with the trumpet, and this is the feel good getting ready to go home moment. So that's always a pleasure to sing that aria because you know everyone's gunning for you.
And fascinating as you so clearly describe how Handel's given a sort of very subtle but very present, probably something that none of us really, myself included, ever stop to realize that that's the way the bass lines are written. But we hear in that declamatory thing using the triads and the arpeggios to give the bass stuff a real sort of sense of exclamation to all of it. So do you think in that same breath that the bass is always heralding something that comes next, or do you think the bass is responding to what comes before, or do you think the bass solos are not that sort of, is the bass always the start of the next chapter?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, it varies, doesn't it? The bass sort of does a fair amount in part one, and then only sings Wide of the Nations in part two, and then comes back in to sing I Tell You a Mystery in part three. So the role that the bass plays is generally quite part one heavy, and I think that's based around judgment and sin, and as a bass you end up always sort of sitting there doing the judgment arias a lot of the time, or sometimes you get the sort of grounding calm arias. I would say that you know, have a look. I've never thought that too deeply, but have a look at that structure I put up. It's on the Wikipedia page if you're interested to see it. There was certainly a moment where Handel went right across what Jennings had intended, and that comes out of He Trusted in God, and then it goes straight into that tenor, Thy rebuke hath broken his heart, and Jennings actually sort of intended a moment off there, but Handel very much intended the one to go into the other. So there are these sort of structural moments where the narrative is played with, but overall I would say there is this roughly pattern that goes on through the piece of some sort of recit followed by a solo followed by a chorus. We get that right from the start. Obviously the prelude to the prelude, but Comfort Ye is a sort of recitative, then Every Valley is the aria, and then And the Glory of the Lord is a chorus. And I read somewhere that someone talks about, actually this is one of the reasons it works very well, because there's almost this ritualistic element and repetition that goes on during the Messiah, and that makes it very soothing and easy to
that was one of the points that I always come back to and wanted to make, was just this idea that, as you say, there's quite a pattern and a routine to this idea of recit, aria, chorus, recit, aria, chorus, but it's never repetitive to the point of becoming dull. But, you know, one of the other big oratorios that Lawrence and I have done recently was Solomon, which is absolutely tremendous. It's more operatic in the sense that the soloists have a much more obvious storytelling role, and their arias, their numbers are much more in the style of something that's operatic. But you get these huge long stretches in Solomon where the chorus does absolutely nothing, and then there's a block where you've got 2 or 3 choruses back to back, and you know, it's still an absolutely wonderful piece. But when you get the rhythm that comes with the structure of Messiah, you see why it has this enduring popularity. And you know, looping things back to what we discussed with performance history as well, with the big choirs in this country that are often the producers of these performances. Choirs don't want to be putting on a performance of an oratorio that has 1 chorus at the end of the first half and all the rest is just arias and solo numbers that are brought in by the soloist. So it has a very practical popularity as well, in that there's lots to do for the chorus. They're all wonderfully contrasting choruses. There's the slow and angry, the fast and angry, there's the slow and reflective, and there's the fast and the slow and reflective. So there's really the most amazing cross-section of styles in all the choruses for Handel, for Messiah, which I think gives it such an enduring popularity.
Absolutely, and I think just the message of the Messiah, as I said in mine, it's just so universal. The idea of redemption, and I think that's what gives it its lasting appeal, particularly.
Yeah, it's not got some of the sort of mythology and, you know, or some of the slightly more obscure stories that, you know, it's not based around some of the stories that are frankly just less well known now for people. That there's something so universal and timeless about Messiah. Brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody. It's been a really fascinating look through all of this. Does anybody have any questions? I'm aware we've run over slightly by time, but if anybody has any questions or just share your observations, I know some of you will have sung this piece dozens and dozens of times. If anybody has any thoughts, Rick, I see your hand is up. Why don't you kick us off?
Well, I was just going to say, the one thing amongst everything else that Messiah has is a wonderful set of final choruses. It is so uplifting to sing. Whether you're in a big choir or a small choir, it doesn't matter. It just works musically. And I think it leaves everybody almost skipping on air as you walk out mentally.
Yeah.
And there are very few oratorios that do that. I think Elijah gets close to it, but there are very few that give you that triumphal exit.
And it's amazing because, you know, from Worthy is the Lamb through Blessing and Honor through the final Amen, you've got about 40 pages of D major, and any other composer, that would be tedious as hell, not having any key changes or any sort of major bits of harmonic interest. But, you know, what a sign of a craftsman that just keeps it going out on such a high through all that grounding in D major right through to the bitter end. It's, it really is quite an ecstatic culmination.
I just add one other thing. I've sung this in various churches. I sing in St. George's in Ashton. I have sung the Hallelujah chorus as the only tenor with 34 other people in the choir. It's rather difficult to make your voice sound when you're only one tenor. Thank you.
Pleasure. Anyone else with some observations? Yeah, hi, Tony.
We for many years, Epworth used to include various of the choruses in the Christmas concert.
Yeah.
And I'd love to be able to do that again when we are able to do a Christmas concert. Things like and the glory of the Lord, etc. They fit in very well, and I think the audience was always very receptive to it.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and particularly as we've had this slightly unusual way of looking at it, this with the choir online. You know, if there's any chance we can do a concert at Christmas this year, it would be a great way to sort of loop back to what we've been doing on Zoom this term by including at least one of the choruses at Christmas. I think it's a really nice idea, and as you say, audiences know it and love it, and I think it'd be a great thing to do. Yeah. Does anybody else have any experience, any sopranos or altos who've sung it? Any things that, you know, bits that you find difficult perhaps, or bits that aren't as sort of obvious from a performer's perspective? I think, you know, looking at a lot of the vocal writing, some of the chorus vocal writing is extremely difficult. And when you're in the midst of it is probably a bit terrifying. But then when you're back from it and you can hear it in the context of the other parts in the orchestra, you know, it takes on a different dimension. Lynn?
When I joined the choir in 2004, my very first rehearsal was partly through the session, and as an alto, I was thrown into singing bits of the Messiah, completely cold, with very, very little experience of sight reading a long time ago. And I was terrified, absolutely terrified of it. But it's one of these things that you just got to persevere with, I think. And you know, coming back to it several times, it's easy every time. It's easier every time, but there's always that element of, oh my God, it's the fast bit coming up. But I would just like to mention something else. I don't know if anyone ever saw a play called All the Angels by a man called Nick Drake. It was at the Globe Sam Wanamaker Theatre a couple of times, and it's about Handel rehearsing and preparing for the first performance of Messiah in Dublin. And it's very interesting. There's lots of excerpts from it, and it was sung by members of the 16 when I saw it. The very first bit of it is about him trying to rehearse with a completely useless choir in a pub in Chester, in the room above the pub, and all the difficulties he faced with it. And a lot of it's about Susanna Kibber, as you mentioned, and how she actually adapted to it. So if anyone sees that coming up, it's an absolutely riveting performance, and it does actually make you think about Messiah in a different way. Thanks.
I'll definitely keep an eye out for that. That rang a distant bell. I think I'd heard that had happened, but didn't go and see it. So that's something to put on the list. And yeah, just with you mentioning Kibber again, I'm fascinated, and I think we should all keep in mind this idea that you know, Handel was constantly changing it. Oh, I had a different soprano soloist, I had a different alto soloist. She had a slightly lower voice. I'm going to rewrite it. I'm going to rescore it. You know, I've got a great tenor soloist, so I'm going to give him an extra number. It's just what he did and what they did back then. But yet we're obsessed in this day and age with, you know, this is what the composer wrote on this day at the premiere, and never again shall it change or be adapted. I think we should all bear it in mind that things were fluid, and we should continue to respect that fluidity, that obviously the composer and the performers were all fully aware and comfortable of doing back then.
It's also worth saying that just thinking about you being thrown in at the deep end, Lynn, and what's quite interesting about Handel stuff, very rarely does he write outside of 4 parts. Or if he does, he'll tend to write double choir stuff, so Israel and Egypt. Very rare that you get 5 parts. Sometimes you get 3 in the Chandos anthems. And but actually a lot of his music was also sung by the boys at the Chapel Royal. And so the music was in some ways versatile from the start, and robust enough to be sung by and back then some of the altos would have been boys with changing voices anyway. So yeah, I just think of you being thrown in there, Lynn, and thinking of poor choristers back in 1732 trying to learn it as well.
Well, and interesting, I thought that it was fascinating that first performance with both sets of cathedral choirs from St Patrick's and Christchurch in Dublin, they still needed to have the 4 soloists sing all the chorus parts as well. So, you know, you had 2 independent cathedral choirs, both of whom would assumedly stand up on their own when they're singing their cathedral services, but coming together to do this, be double forces, they still needed the soloists or they still decided to have the soloists adding to them as reinforcement. So it's interesting and, you know, fascinating, tantalizing to think what things must have sounded like back then, and what the standard was like, and what the quality was like. And yeah, it's the mind boggles really as to what things must have been like. Brilliant, folks. It's been thoroughly enjoyable doing all this. Thank you very much, Lawrence, for your contribution. I've learned a lot this evening. I've learned stuff myself on the way, learning and researching all this. And I hope we've all taken away something that next time we open our scores, just give us an extra thing to think about with this amazing piece. And Lawrence mentioned Wikipedia. You know, there is so much stuff. Just keep reading, have a look online, and listen to lots of different recordings. You know, there are myriad performances from all different size and scale and dates, so just indulge yourself and find out. And yeah, but it's been really wonderful. Thanks all for joining. It's been a lovely thing to do on a Monday. I've recorded this, I'm going to upload it, and I'll send a link round so that any people who weren't here can tune in again. Just to remind, so we're on fortnightly sessions now. The next one is going to be a session on sort of vocal health, which with a specific emphasis on Messiah. So all the high stuff, whatever voice part you are, all the semiquavers, all the runs, we're going to sort of talk about those and how we can best approach those with a bit of private practice and in rehearsals. Then 2 weeks after that, the 1st of March, we're going to do a sight reading workshop, which is going to be a lot of it's not going to be so much actively singing, but just how can we help with singing the notes of Messiah and all the other music we sing as well. 15th of March is musicianship skills. So how to help with the information on the page and how to understand it and quickly decipher through all of it to help with our rehearsals and when things are moving quickly. And then what will conclude our season of workshops nicely on the 29th of March is a bit of a record review. So we're going to look at lots of performances of Messiah from all the different permutations we've discussed and share our thoughts about those, and some which may work better than others, and look forward to seeing you at those. So yeah, fortnightly from now, 2 till 3 on Mondays. But take care, really great to see you all. Have a good rest of day, and I'll see lots of you on Wednesday evening. Thanks again. Thanks, Lawrence. See you all soon.
Bye.